Hey everybody, Mr. Grove here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the general features and traits of the animals in the animal kingdom. And then we'll talk a little bit about the systems that make up these animals. So starting with some common traits that come along with the animal kingdom. Number one, they are heterotrophic. So a lot like fungus, they cannot make their own food. They have to get their food from somewhere. Plant kingdom, a little different. They can make their own food, but animals cannot. Now, there will be a few exceptions where, like a coral reef, where there might be animals that work symbiotically with some either protists or plants, but for the most part, that would be an exception to the rule. So heterotrophic. Mobility, animals are very mobile, so that's a huge factor. You have the chance to go for more food and keep from being food. If you're a plant and you need food or water and there's some over there, you have to slowly grow roots to that. But with an animal, your mobility allows you to just kind of move over there towards it. So another huge advantage for the animal kingdom. Multicellularity. So all animals are multicellular. We don't have any single-celled organisms anymore. Diploidy, this is a big factor. You've got a double set of chromosomes, and most animals are diploid for the majority of their life cycle. A double set of chromosomes means if you have a bad gene on one chromosome, you've got a copy, so you could just use the good copy. Sexual reproduction, that is the general choice of animals. We have some asexual reproduction possibilities with certain animals, but for the most part, the general preference would be sexual reproduction. And the big advantage here is genetic variety. So that would give more genetic variety and better success for the animal in that spot. No cell wall. So plants have cell wall, bacteria have cell wall, fungus have cell wall, animals do not. We like to say that's why you're squishy. But the thing is, it gives you better mobility. So you're not as rigid, and better mobility means, again, you can get better food and keep from being food. Blastula formation. So after a zygote is fertilized, then we start going through cell division, 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, until we get a small ball of cells called a blastula. And then that blastula will start to give rise to different types of what we would call pre-tissue. And that can be ecto, endo, or mesoderm, and then that will give rise to what we call tissues, and that's cells that are working together. And so that's our final one that we see, tissues. That, when cells start to work together, they can become more complex in an organism, and that organism can become more complex as well. Let's talk about the pre-tissue layers. So we have ecto and endo and mesoderm, and so these are not tissues per se, but it's kind of layers of cells that will start to form tissues. And so ecto means outside, so this is going to be outside stuff like skin, your nervous system, sensory organs, things like that. Endo is inside, so this is going to be a lot of your digestive, your lungs, urinary bladder, liver. And then M for middle, M for mesoderm. So this is going to be the middle thing. So skeleton, muscles, circulatory, all of these would be then in the middle part of the body. Once those pre-tissues develop, then we have to have body symmetry. So we could be bilateral, that means the left and right halves, or we could be radial, that means kind of around a central point. So radius, kind of a circle, kind of reference. And then asymmetrical, so no symmetry. So that prefix A means nothing. So just like if you don't have symptoms for COVID, you would be asymptomatic. So our bat here would have a left and right side, so that'd be bilateral. Our butterfly would be bilateral. Our little planaria would be bilateral. Our radial, so our sea urchin would be radial, kind of going around a center point. Our starfish would be radial, again, going around the center point. Our sea anemone would be a radial, going around a center point. But our sponge would be asymmetrical, so there's not really any kind of symmetry at all. So that's our body symmetry plan. Another thing to note is coelom. So a coelom is a fluid-filled space between the body wall and the digestive tract. And so the coelom will help give some cushionary protection and in some cases can be used for transferring food and nutrients. So in this case, this will help us kind of divide up animals into different categories. So all three of these are worms: flatworms, roundworms, segmented worms. But we can kind of break them apart. So the flatworms are going to be acoelomates. So that prefix A again means they don't have a coelom. So if you look closely here, in the mesoderm, which is in the red, there's no space. So flatworms would be acoelomates. Pseudo means fake. So if you have a pseudonym, we know that's a fake name. And so they have a mesoderm, and there is a space, but it's not completely surrounded by mesoderm cavities. So that would be a pseudocoelomate, and that's going to be our roundworms. Segmented worms, like earthworms and leeches, are going to be what we would call coelomates. So if you notice in the red here, there's a space that's completely filled or completely surrounded by mesoderm. So acoelom, pseudocoelom, and coelom, just a way that we can help kind of categorize things. Body segmentation is another advantage that animals will have. So these are repeating body parts. Okay. So in the case of the earthworm, we have all these repeating segments. In the abdomen of our moth, all these repeating segments. Our lobster, repeating segments. Our centipede, repeating segments. And so what that will do is it will help give the organism an ability, if some of those segments get damaged or destroyed, then there's more of them. So you as humans, you have repeating segments based on your vertebrae and your phalanges. So those are some small repetitive segments to your body. So now let's talk about some of the systems. And so understanding these systems will help us when we say a sponge does not have a digestive system, or if we say a jellyfish has a gastrovascular cavity, or we say a white-tailed deer has a complete digestive tract. So what does that mean exactly? Well, if you're really simple, so like sponges would be that, then your cell kind of acts on their own. They don't need a big system to do anything because the food goes straight to the cell, the waste comes straight out of the cell. So that would be digesting intracellularly. The problem is, unlike SpongeBob, who likes his Krabby Patties, he can't eat those because if he's going to digest intracellularly inside the cell, the food has to be small enough to fit inside the cell. So as we get more complex, then animals will have the ability to kind of start to digest extracellularly. And so that's a gastrovascular cavity or complete digestive. So if we have a gastrovascular cavity, we have one opening. And it's a little gross if you think about it. So that means your mouth is your pooper, so the food will go in, be in the gastrovascular cavity, digested, and then it will come out the same opening then as waste. We have what's called a complete digestive tract. So two openings, so your mouth is not your pooper. So the food will go in, and the slow process of digestion will start, and then will be expelled through the anus. And that is many complex animals that will have that process. And that just aids in the efficiency of getting all of the nutrients they can out of the food. So digestion system, so we could either have nothing, gastrovascular cavity, or a complete digestive tract. Respiratory, so if you are an animal, that means you do cellular respiration, so you breathe in O2 and expel CO2. Again, if you're simple enough, like a jellyfish, the oxygen just comes into the cell, the CO2 just goes out. If you are, some animals can respire across their skin. So that'd be like earthworms, frogs, things like that. But you have to keep the skin moist for that. If we're going to get very big, though, that means we're going to be moving a lot of oxygen and CO2. And so what we have to do is have a pretty complex system. And so aquatic animals will have what's called gills to help exchange the oxygen and CO2. And terrestrial will have like what's called lungs. So our shrimp and our Nemo, these would be gills. Our moose and our Komodo dragon would be terrestrial, so they would have lungs. This guy here, you might think, well, that's a fish. Does it have gills? Well, it's not technically a fish. That'd be a whale. And whales are mammals, so he's doing just like you do, holding his breath to swim underwater. It's just he has a lot bigger lungs. Instead of a couple of minutes, he can hold it for 30 or 40 minutes. So that is the respiratory. So oxygen goes in, CO2 comes out. Circulatory. So again, if you're simple enough, you don't need a system. Just stuff goes into the cell and it comes right back out the cell. But if we want to get very complex at all, we need a system. And so we have two possibilities here: open circulatory and closed circulatory. So open's not near as efficient, so the heart will pump the blood-like substance, and that will allow the blood to be just kind of pumped throughout the open cavities of the body. And so in this case, that open cavity then, you may be putting some oxygen in there or you may not be. It kind of just depends on how the luck of the draw of the cells. If we talk about a closed circulatory system, so a closed circulatory system is going to have the heart containing the blood completely in vessels, and so we're guaranteed that all of that blood will be oxygenated before it gets to the cells that need it. And so this is a very efficient thing. So when we get animals that start to have closed circulatory, they can do a lot cooler things for a lot longer. So here would be your closed circulatory. So your arteries in red will take oxygenated blood to the cells, and then the veins in blue will take it back to the heart and the lungs. So that is the circulatory system. Another system is the nerve system, and this is the one that we probably know the least about. So the nervous system is going to, again, if you're simple enough, you just kind of have this nerve net, so the cells just kind of work together, linked, but not like coordination. They can do things. If we start to have a little bit of a central point, like a brain, simple brain, this is going to be called a ganglia. So this is very simple or very evident in our flatworms, planaria. But then as we get a little bit more complex even, then we would have actual brains. So these would be complex nerve organs with the sensory organs closely by them. And that's what we call being cephalized. So if you have a distinct head-like region, like pinky in the brain here, then you would be cephalized. In fact, we even call this class of mollusks the cephalopods because they actually have a distinct head-like region. So that's our nervous system. Support system or structure, so skeletal. So again, if you're a worm or jellyfish, then you're going to have what's called a hydrostatic skeleton. So this is kind of a fluid-contained skeleton, so kind of like a water balloon would be to give structure. The other types would be exo and endo. So exo's on the outside, so this would be like our arthropods, like our crab and insects. And then endoskeleton would be like all of this over here. And so that's going to be the bones inside the body, and that's what you are. And so skeletal systems are very good for providing support and protection for internal organs, but then also muscle point attachment. So you can move your limbs because your muscles are connected to that skeletal part, and when they contract, the limb moves. Another system is the excretory system. So one of my good friends growing up, his dad was a urologist, so we heard all kinds of fun excretory system stories. And this is going to be the removal of waste. Now you might be thinking, didn't we cover that? Isn't that what digestion was? But this is different waste. So this is cellular metabolism waste, so chemicals that your cells produce like ammonia. And we've got to figure out a way to get that out of the cells. And so it goes to through your blood to your kidneys. Your kidneys will filter that out and will put the good stuff back in the bloodstream and will filter out the bad stuff and create what's called urea. And then the urea will be lost in a solution called urine. Now, if you are an aquatic invertebrate, so like a fish, or if you were a fish, then you just diffuse this ammonia and things straight through your gills. The problem is this loses a lot of water. You don't mind, you live in water, and so it's no big deal to lose it. But if you're a terrestrial animal, say you're a coyote in the desert, water's a big deal. And so you want to make sure that you are as efficient as possible. And so this system of creating the urea and the urine that goes through the bladder and is expelled through the urethra, that's a much more efficient system to minimize water loss. So that is the excretory system. And then lastly, we have our reproductive system. And so we know that animals can asexually reproduce. Some animals can, but most animals will prefer to sexually reproduce. And so that's the sperm that are formed in the testes fertilizing with the eggs formed in the ovaries. Some animals can do both, or have actually both reproductive parts, and we call that hermaphroditic. So an earthworm would be an example of a hermaphroditic organism. So they have both female and male reproductive organs, so a seminal vesicle and a seminal receiver. Some animals uniquely do what's called parthenogenesis, and that's where we actually get a new organism from an unfertilized gamete. And so this is like honeybees and some other insects will do something like that. External fertilization versus internal fertilization. So both would be sexual reproduction. But in external fertilization, the sperm is released outside the female's body. So the female has lots of eggs. She releases them. The male has the sperm. He releases them. And we're hoping that the sperm will swim towards the egg. Hoping doesn't usually cut it. This is a really low percentage of success rate for fertilization. So because it's so low of percent, we have to have a lot of it. And so that's why females make a lot of eggs in the case of fish and other organisms that do external fertilization. Internal fertilization, the sperm fertilizes inside the female's body. This is so much more efficient because there's so much better protection for the sperm to reach the egg. So this would be like our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals. Now, after fertilization, depending on the animal, so they might get rid of the eggs outside, so like reptiles and birds, or they might have what's called live birth. And we'll talk about that when we get into mammals and birds and reptiles later on. So that is some basic animal traits and the basic animal systems. And hopefully by knowing that, that will help us out as we journey through the animal kingdom and understand why different phylum and different classes of animals are put in those classes based on these different traits that they possess. So I hope that was helpful.